I have been a hospice nurse for 11 years, and I have held the hands of strangers in their final hours. I have sat beside people who had everything and people who had nothing. I have watched life leave a body more times than I can count, and I have learned that death does not care about your plans or your unfinished business, or the things you never said out loud. And I thought I had seen everything, and I had not seen this. And my name is Renee, and I grew up believing my father chose to disappear. And that is the story my mother told me. Not once, not twice. She told it to me the way some mothers tell bedtime stories, repeatedly and with complete confidence that every word was true. And she said his name was Gerald. She said he was charming and handsome and completely unreliable. She said that when I was 2 years old, he walked out the front door of our apartment in Cleveland and never came back. She said she tried to find him. She said he did not want to be found. And I grew up with that story living inside my chest like a stone. And I did not cry about it after a certain age. Crying felt like giving him something he did not deserve. Instead, I became someone who did not need people to stay. I became someone who showed up for others completely and with her whole heart because I understood at a very young age that showing up was a choice and most people did not make it. And that is probably why I became a nurse. And that is definitely why I became a hospice nurse. And I wanted to be the person who stayed. And I moved to Portland 14 years ago for a relationship that did not last and a city that I ended up loving more than I expected. I built a life here. I have a small house with a garden I am terrible at maintaining. I have 2 cats named after jazz musicians. I have colleagues who became friends and a routine that feels like something I chose rather than something that happened to me. And I was content. That is the honest word. Not always happy. Not without loneliness. But content in the way that feels earned rather than accidental. And the hospice facility where I work is called Maplewood, and it is a good place. I know that sounds like a strange thing to say about somewhere people go to die, but it is true. The staff is careful and kind. The rooms have windows. There is a garden that families can use, and we keep fresh flowers in the common area, and we play music softly in the hallways, and we treat every person who comes through those doors like their life has mattered, because it has. And I have been proud to work there for 9 years. And nothing prepared me for the morning Gerald was admitted. And it was a Tuesday in October. And the air outside had that particular sharpness that comes in early fall, and I remember thinking on my drive in that it was the kind of morning that made you feel like the world was paying attention. I had coffee in my travel mug, and the radio was playing something quiet, and I felt perfectly ordinary. And our charge nurse Sandra met me at the front desk with a new patient chart the way she always does on my shift. She handed it to me and said his name and room number and gave me the brief summary. Lung cancer stage 4. 71 years old. Transferred from a hospital in Seattle. No local family on record. A social worker named Diane had been assigned to his case because he had listed no emergency contacts. And I took the chart, and I looked down at the name. And Gerald Dennis Moore. And I stood there at the front desk, and I did not move for what Sandra later told me was long enough that she asked me twice if I was all right. And I told her I was fine. And I was not fine. You breathe. You do your job. You feel the feelings later in a place where the feelings are not someone else's problem. And I used my protocol. And I walked to room 14. And I knocked softly the way we always do, and I opened the door, and the man in the bed turned his head toward me, and I understood immediately and completely that I was looking at my father. And I knew because of his eyes. And my whole life I had looked in mirrors and wondered where my eyes came from. My mother had brown eyes, and I had these unusual gray-green eyes that looked different depending on the light. I had never seen them on another human face. And I was seeing them now. And he was thin the way late-stage cancer makes a person thin, like the body is quietly withdrawing from itself. His hair was white and sparse. His hands on the blanket were large and spotted with age. But those eyes, when they found my face, were clear and present, and exactly the color of mine. And he said hello in a voice that was weaker than it probably used to be. And I said hello back. And I told him my name was Renee, and I would be his nurse today. And something moved across his face when I said my name. Something quick and complicated that he pulled back before it became anything visible. And I took his vitals. I checked his chart. I did my job with the steadiness I had spent 11 years building, and when I left his room, I walked directly to the bathroom at the end of the hall and stood at the sink with the water running and breathed. And I did not tell anyone that day. And I went home that night, and I sat in my kitchen for a very long time, and I thought about what I was going to do. And the logical thing, the professional thing, was to disclose the potential conflict to my supervisor and ask to be reassigned. That was the clean answer. That was the answer that protected everyone. And I did not want the clean answer. And I had spent 32 years without a father, and now he was in room 14 of my hospice facility dying of lung cancer with no one to sit with him, and I was not ready to hand that situation to someone else before I understood what it was. And I called my best friend Tamara that night. Tamara is a therapist, which is both convenient and occasionally exhausting. She listened to everything I said without interrupting, which is one of her best qualities. When I was done, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said something I have thought about many times since. And she said, "Renee, you do not have to decide tonight what this man is to you. You only have to decide if you are going to give yourself the chance to find out." And I went to sleep without an answer. And I woke up knowing I was going back. And I requested to remain on his care rotation. I told Sandra I had connected well with him on the first day, which was true in a way I could not explain to her. She agreed without question because continuity of care matters in hospice work, and a patient with no family visitors is exactly the kind of person we try to provide consistency for. And for the first 3 days, I was purely his nurse. And I brought his medication on schedule. I monitored his pain levels. I adjusted his pillows and brought him extra blankets because he was always cold, and I made sure his water was fresh and within reach. I did everything I would have done for any patient, and I kept my feelings in the protocol place where feelings wait. And he was polite and quiet. He did not complain. He asked thoughtful questions about his medication and what to expect as things progressed, and he listened carefully to my answers. He had the manner of someone who had learned to be self-contained, someone who did not expect comfort from other people and was genuinely surprised when it arrived. And on the 4th day, I was adjusting his foreline, and he said, "Can I ask you something?" And I said, "Of course." And he said, "Renee is an unusual name. I knew someone named Renee once a long time ago. Someone important." And my hands kept moving. My voice stayed level. And I said, "Was she someone you were close to?" And he looked at the window for a long time. And he said, "She was my daughter." And I put down what was in my hands. And I sat in the chair beside his bed, the chair the family members use, and I folded my hands in my lap, and I looked at him, and I said, "Gerald." My mother's name was Patricia. Her maiden name was Hollis, and she grew up in Akron. I was born in Cleveland in October 1991. I have gray-green eyes that I never knew where they came from until 4 days ago. And the silence in that room was the loudest thing I have ever heard. And he closed his eyes. He did not close them the way people do when they are tired. He closed them the way people do when something they have carried for a very long time has finally made contact with the ground. And he said, "Renee," and not a question, just my name, like he was confirming to himself that I was real. And I said, "Yes." And he said, "I looked for you. I want you to know that first before anything else. I looked for you for years." And he talked for a long time that day. And he told me that he and my mother had separated when I was 2 years old. He told me that the separation was not peaceful and that there were things said and done on both sides that none of them could take back. He told me that my mother had moved and not told him where. He told me that when he tried to find us through her family told him she did not want contact. And he told me he hired a private investigator when I was 7 years old. He told me the investigator found a Patricia Moore who had remarried and had a daughter whose school records were now under a different name. He told me he wrote a letter and sent it through the investigator and never received a response. And he told me he stopped looking after that. Not because he stopped caring. Because he decided that forcing himself into my life, if my mother had decided she wanted him gone, might hurt me more than his absence already had. And he told me he thought about me every year on my birthday. And he told me my birthday was October 14th. And he was right. And I did not speak for a long time after he finished. And I am a person who processes carefully. I have learned that my first reaction to something large is not always the most accurate one. So I sat with what he had told me, and I let it settle, and I felt all of the feelings move through without deciding right then what they meant. And finally I said, I grew up believing you chose to leave. And he said, I know. I am so sorry that was the story you had. And I said, I do not know what the full truth is. I only have your side, and I cannot get my mother's because she passed away 6 years ago. And he said, I know I cannot prove anything to you. I know you have no reason to trust me. I just want you to know that you were never nothing to me. Not for a single day. And I went home that night, and I cried in a way I had not cried since my mother's funeral. And I cried for the 2-year-old who did not understand why her father was gone. I cried for the 7-year-old who waited for something to arrive that never did. I cried for the 12-year-old who took another man's last name because she had decided the original one did not want her. I cried for every version of myself that had organized her entire personality around not needing someone to stay. And I cried for a long time, and then I did something I did not expect. And I felt something loosen. And not forgiveness. Not yet. Not the complete and finished kind. But something preliminary to it. Something that felt like the possibility of laying down a weight I had forgotten I was carrying because I had been carrying it so long it felt like part of my body. And I went back the next morning. And I went back every morning after that. And I stopped being only his nurse fairly quickly. Sandra knew something was happening, and she was kind enough to let me manage it without making it official. She reassigned his primary nursing duties to my colleague James, and let me be what I actually was, which was a daughter visiting her father. And we had 17 days. And I know that sounds like nothing. 17 days against 32 years of absence is not a fair trade, and I want to be honest about that. I did not come to some beautiful clean peace with everything in 17 days. I still had anger living in me alongside the grief. I still had questions I would never get complete answers to. The story of what happened between my parents and why I grew up without him is something I will spend years still sorting through. But in those 17 days, I learned who he was. And he had been a high school history teacher for 20 years. He loved maps and could talk about cartography for longer than most people wanted to listen. He had been married once after my mother, briefly and unhappily. He had no other children. He had lived alone in a small house outside of Seattle, and he had a neighbor named Ruth who checked on him and who cried on the phone when I called to introduce myself. And he had a sense of humor that was dry and quiet and that appeared at unexpected moments. And he was brave about his dying in a way that I recognized because I had seen it in good people before, the ones who make peace with it not because they are not afraid, but because they decide that fear is not how they want to spend the time they have left. And he asked me questions about my life with genuine curiosity. He wanted to know about nursing and how I had come to choose it and what it felt like to do the work I do. He wanted to know about Portland and my house and my cats. He wanted to know about relationships I had had and whether I was happy. And I told him things I had not told many people. And not because he had earned it exactly, but because time was the one thing we did not have, and I did not want to waste what was left performing a distance that was not serving either of us. And on his 14th day, he was much weaker. And he slept more. His pain was being managed carefully, and he was comfortable, but the conversations were shorter now, and I did most of the talking. I told him about the October when I was 9 and convinced my mother to let me have a birthday party and invited 12 children, and only 4 showed up, and how I had cried in my room afterward, and how my mother had sat on the edge of my bed and told me that 4 good people are worth more than 12 uncertain ones. And he smiled at that. And he said, "Your mother was not wrong about everything." And I said, "No, she was not." And he reached for my hand. And his grip was not strong anymore. But it was there, warm and deliberate and real. And he said, "I am glad it was you who walked through that door." And I said, "Me too." And he died on a Thursday morning before the sun had fully risen. And I was there, and I had arranged to be there. James had called me at 4 in the morning, and I had driven through empty streets in the dark, and I had made it in time to sit with him for the last hour and to hold his hand as his breathing changed and slowed and finally stopped. And the room was quiet. The window was gray with early light. I could hear birds beginning somewhere outside. And I sat with him for a while after. And that is something I do for my patients sometimes, just sit. Let the room be what it is. Acknowledge that a person was here, and now they are not, and that this matters. And it mattered more than usual that morning. And I took 2 weeks of personal leave after Gerald died. And I needed to grieve in the specific and complicated way that this loss required, because it was not one grief but several stacked on top of each other. I was grieving a man I had known for 17 days. I was grieving the father I never had. I was grieving the childhood version of myself who had needed an explanation and never gotten one. I was grieving my mother too in a new way now that I understood the story was more complicated than she had let on. And Tamara helped me hold all of it without asking me to sort it into neat categories. And I also called Ruth, his neighbor in Seattle. She had driven down to collect a few things from his room after he passed, and she sat with me in the Maplewood garden for an hour and told me stories about him that I wrote down in a notebook I still have. She told me he kept a photo in his kitchen, small and old and slightly faded, of a baby girl with unusual eyes. She had always assumed it was a niece or a family friend's child. She had never asked. And I asked her what happened to the photo. And she said she had brought it with her. And she gave it to me. And I went back to work on a Monday in November. And Sandra hugged me before I could even put my bag down. James brought me coffee. The woman who manages our front reception, whose name is Dolores, had left a small plant on the nurse's station with a note that just said, "We are glad you are here." And I stood in that hallway with my coffee and my plant, and I looked at these people I had worked beside for years, and I felt something I want to try to describe accurately. And I felt located. And that is the best word I have. Located, like a point on one of Gerald's beloved maps. Not lost. Not drifting. Here. And I think about him often now. And not always with sadness. Sometimes with something that is almost gratitude, which surprised me when I first recognized it because gratitude seemed too generous given everything. But I am grateful for the 17 days. I am grateful that whatever combination of circumstances put him in that particular facility in my particular rotation on a Tuesday in October gave us those days instead of nothing. And I am grateful that I did not walk away from the door of room 14. And I think about the version of me that might have asked for reassignment, that might have protected herself from the complication of it, that might have decided the professional choice was also the right personal choice and handed his care to someone else and never knocked on that door. And I think about her, and I feel something like tenderness toward her, and also something like relief that she is not who I turned out to be. And there is a particular kind of closure that does not look the way you imagined it would. And I spent 32 years imagining that if I ever found my father, the closure would be dramatic. Confrontational maybe. Full of answers that finally made the story make sense. A scene from a film where everything resolves into something comprehensible and complete. And what I got was 17 days with a dying man who loved maps and had dry humor and had kept a faded photograph of me in his kitchen for decades. And what I got was complicated and partial and full of things I will never fully know. And what I got was enough. And maybe more than enough. And maybe exactly what I needed even if it was not what I had imagined. And I still work at Maplewood. And I still sit with people in their final hours and hold hands with strangers and make sure that the last thing someone knows in this life is that they are not alone. I have always believed in this work. I believe in it more now. And because I know something about it from the other side now. And I know what it meant to Gerald that someone who cared, even someone whose caring was complicated and new and still in the process of becoming, was in the room. And I know what it meant to me to be there. And we gave each other something in those 17 days. And I do not have a perfect word for what it was. But it was real. And real, I have learned, is worth more than perfect. And every single time,